But with that said, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back from your parallel sessions, to those of you who've been to those, and to this final session of the day. I hope it's been a very productive and interesting conference so far. My impression is that it has been, because I arrived just earlier in the midst of a break, and there were so many people there buzzing like bees, sharing stories, experiences, ideas. So my impression is that this is a very good conference so far for moving forward our work on climate adaptation. And again, a special welcome to those of you who are not here physically at the conference, but who are following us by live streaming. My name is Petter Hojem, and I'm Deputy Director at the Climate Division at the Swedish Ministry of Environment and Energy. And I'm very excited to be the moderator for this day's event, which will focus on the IPCC's special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees. And the IPCC, as you may know, is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And it is the preeminent global body for assessing global climate change science. And it was actually given the Nobel Peace Prize a few years ago for doing that work. And the work of the IPCC is extremely important because it very much guides and creates an understanding, a shared understanding of climate change when countries come together to negotiate climate agreements. So my colleagues who will be going to Poland in a few weeks from now for this year's climate conference will be very much informed by the work that has been done by the IPCC. And the report that we will focus on today was published just a couple of weeks ago. And in the words of one NGO representative, the report is a polite way of scientists telling policymakers, act now, idiots. So in this session, we will both present to you the report that was produced, how it was produced, its main findings, and put it in a broader context, and what it means for both mitigation and adaptation. And all this within just 1 hour. And to do this, we have a panel of 4 very distinguished speakers. And after they have made each of their presentations, we will have a common panel discussion. During that discussion, you will be given a possibility to ask them questions. And we very much invite you to come up with tough questions to our speakers. So I encourage you already now to think of questions that you'd like to ask towards the end of the session. But let's not lose any more time, because I would like now to invite up the first speaker, who is Markku Rummukainen. And Markku will focus on the scope and process behind the 1.5 degree report. Markku is professor of climatology at Lund University and also a member of the recently established Swedish Climate Policy Council, which is tasked to evaluate the government's climate policy and whether it's in line with our climate targets. And furthermore, you are national IPCC focal point at SMHI, the Swedish Meteorological Hydrological Institute, and thereby you have a very good knowledge of the report and how it came about. So Markku, please take the floor.
Thank you. The report came from somewhere and it's going somewhere, and in between it's making waves in different contexts at authorities, governments, international organizations, NGOs, you people, we people. And I'm just gonna, with a few words, try to provide the background, and then you get to the exciting stuff of what the report actually says. The background is that in Paris, December 2015, where the countries of the world came up with a new global temperature goal, other things, the Paris Agreement. There also was a discussion on whether well below 2 degrees centigrade was a good enough goal. Many countries did not think so. The small island states, for example, least developed countries, but also other countries, and they call for 1.5, that the global warming should be stopped before reaching or at 1.5 degrees about the pre-industrial level. But it's also clear that there was fairly little science on 1.5 at that time. So nobody was, or the countries as a whole were not prepared to take that step. Rather, they asked the IPCC whether the IPCC could do an assessment on the available science on 1.5 and what is relevant for 1.5. The request was well received by the IPCC. They said in 2016, yes, we will do the report. And in addition to 1.5, we also look at the connection to sustainable development, poverty reduction, and so on in the report, which is, of course, now in the contents as well. The report has been done according to the IPCC guidelines. The process has been followed, even though it was produced in a short time compared to previous reports in less than 2 years. The report in numbers, 91 lead authors and lead authors from 40 countries, an additional 100 plus contributing authors. There were who went through 6,000 scientific studies, got further assistance from more than 1,000 expert reviewers who looked at the successive drafts of the report, and the expert reviewers who provided in total 42,001 comments, which the authors sort of processed, took into account, and which are reflected in the quality of the final report. The report looks pretty much on 4 main things. It looks at mitigation pathways or emission pathways or development pathways, how the world could develop in different terms which would lead into emissions going down fast enough for the world to stay at 1.5 or below 1.5. But the report also looks at impacts on human systems, natural systems. The report looks at how the global response, the global climate action, mitigation adaptation, how could the ambition level be even higher? How could it be speeded up? And as mentioned, the report looks into the connections between climate change, sustainable development, poverty reduction, eradication, and reducing inequalities. The sort of 3 things from the report. The first one is that we are getting awfully close to 1.5 degrees centigrade. We are at 1 now, and we are almost there. The second one is that, well, there are impacts of climate change. There will be more at 1.5, there will be more at 2 degrees, and they will rise even further. And the third one, of course, is that time is running out if we were to act on the 1.5 degree goal. And more about this coming very, very soon. Finally, well, again, in Paris, in the Paris Agreement, the countries decided that in 2018 we'll have something that was called, at the time, the Facilitative Dialogue. The first time since Paris that the countries would get together, look at where we are, the world, in mitigation, where the emissions are going, what the ambition levels, if they could be higher. And for this, the meaning is that the special report on 1.5 degree global warming will provide the scientific backdrop, the scientific starting point on basing the discussions, the political discussions. And it's really interesting to see how the world decides to act in Katowice in just a few weeks' time and what comes then. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Marco. Before we let the next person up on stage, I just want to ask you one question. And as some of you perhaps may have read or heard, President Trump said that it was a clear sign that the IPCC had a political agenda, which is perhaps not very surprising coming from him. But apart from President Trump, what would you say public reactions so far have been to the report?
Mixed, in the sense that I've heard the report both being called alarmistic or being, well, alarm report, being balanced, but also being conservative. So it really depends on where one is going. What I understand, the authors are happy with the report. They see that the science has been displayed in a correct way, so that the contents actually inform us about what we know, how well we know it, where there are knowledges and so on. So it's a bit mixed, sort of something for everyone. But overall, I think the point of gravity is that it's a good product that we can use in the continued work.
Okay. Thank you very much, Marco.
Thank you.
And please take your seat while we welcome up the next speaker, who is Mattias Fridal. Mattias will be speaking about 1.5 consistent pathways and whether they are possible. Mattias is Research Fellow at the Center for Climate Science and Policy Research here at Linköping University. Or Linköping, what would you say in English?
Linköping.
Linköping.
I guess.
I tried. And in your research, you've had a special focus on international climate policy. Apparently, you've been to more than 20 of these international climate negotiations. I do not envy you. And in particular, you've had a focus on negative emissions, which play a very big role in the IPCC's 1.5-degree report. So we are looking forward to hearing more about this now. So the stage is yours.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to dive right into this directly, giving you a glimpse of the scenarios or the pathways to 1.5. And when you do that, you want typically to have a likelihood associated with the target or the goal. If you want to reach 1.5, I'm going to talk about 66% likelihood of meeting the 1.5-degree goal. So you can have different kinds of likelihoods associated with meeting the goal. I've selected this one to talk about something called a carbon budget. So if you have this, you have a goal and you have a likelihood with which you want to meet the goal, you can talk about carbon budgets. And carbon budgets basically means the amount of emissions you can put into the atmosphere before you have induced a 1.5-degree warming. I will take the carbon budgets from the special report on 1.5 degrees. You have many different carbon budgets out there. I'm going to talk about these budgets, which gives us, since pre-industrial times up until 2100, when we want to evaluate whether we meet the goal or not, it gives us a budget of 2,620 gigatons, plus or minus. And I'm not going to talk about uncertainties a whole lot, but there are many and great uncertainties associated with carbon budgets. So when you think or when you read into the report, you have to think about these budgets. It may be, or these uncertainties, it may be that we have already blown the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees, or it may be that it's a bit larger or bigger than the one I'll talk about. But they are many, these uncertainties. But let's take the median then, scenario, 2,620 gigatons. By today, 2017, we have already emitted 2,200 gigatons. And with current emission rates of about 42 gigatons per year, if they are unabated, but also if they don't increase in the coming decade, we will have depleted this budget in 10 years, by 2028. So it's a short time span, and even in the idealized world of climate integrated assessment models, we cannot achieve zero emissions by 2028. It's practically infeasible in a sense. Okay, so what the models do is they introduce a period of lending, a period of emitting more than the carbon budget allows, basically running into a budget deficit. And by 2050, roughly, we are achieving net zero emissions in most of the scenarios that take us to 1.5-degree warming. And after 2050, we have to pay back. We have to start removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, basically. A challenging task. The way we do this is through something called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS. This is currently an uncommercial technology and relatively unproven technology, but it has to be, in most of the scenarios, upscaled dramatically. We also need to afforestate. We need afforestation. Okay, so we need to move from deforestation rates to global afforestation rates, basically, to suck up carbon from the atmosphere. Okay, the scale by which this is done is in the order of 100 to 1,000 gigatons. So the more extreme of these scenarios, they apply a huge amount of this kind of lending from the future generations. Okay, and why is the span so big? This has to do with the broad range of scenarios. So I'm going to show you two illustrative models, or two illustrative scenarios, basically, on the far sort of extremes of the scenario landscape. This one is the most ambitious one, or one of the most ambitious ones, when it comes to immediate mitigation action. So if you reduce emissions in the coming decade very, very dramatically, then you will not have to rely on so many negative emissions in the future, basically. In this scenario, you don't even have to apply BECCS at all. You can do with afforestation only. But it also means that the energy demand in these scenarios are reduced dramatically. The energy system is actually shrinking in these kinds of scenarios. On the other end of the scenario, or different scenarios, you have typically these kinds of scenarios. With continued path dependency, you continue to demand energy at similar scales as today, and you eat the same kind of food or even more meat in the future, and so on and so forth. You have uncoordinated international politics, which will create a need for technological fixes in the future and a much higher dependency on bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. But in both of these cases, we do meet in these scenarios the 1.5-degree goal. So it's theoretically possible to achieve it in many different ways, according to the scenarios. The question is if it's practically feasible, if there are political preconditions for this and social preconditions. And if you start looking into this, on this graph you have the different scenarios I showed you before, the two extremes and all the scenarios in between that are assessed by the 1.5-degree report. Most of them, or almost all of them, say that we need to achieve net zero emissions by roughly 2050. The most ambitious climate target we have in the world today is the Swedish one. It's by far the most ambitious climate target. It achieves net zero, if we fulfill it, it achieves net zero emissions by 2045. Roughly the same as what's requested on global scale to meet the 1.5-degree goal in these scenarios. Okay, another way of looking into this is to look at the nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement that Marco spoke about. If you look at the collective ambition of these, it takes us somewhere between 50 to 58 gigatons in the period 2020 to 2030. If we do everything we promise in the world, we are actually going to increase emissions. That's the contributions to the Paris Agreement. And it's very different from the idealized, the scenario pathway, the cost-efficient pathways in the scenarios. Actually, in the IPCC report, there is also one section looking into the so-called emission gap by 2030. If you consider a full implementation of NDCs, the most ambitious implementation of them, and then compare it to the median scenario for 1.5 degrees Celsius, you have an emission gap of approximately 27 gigatons. So the longer we postpone mitigation, the more we have to rely on negative emissions in the future. That's basically the key takeaway message of this. And the harder, the more problematic it will be to achieve 1.5. So it's theoretically possible, but it's also very, very, it demands a lot from politics and from societies to be able to make this transformation. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Matthias. And before I let you sit down again, I want to ask you just one follow-up question on the last slide. You're saying it's theoretically possible, but very challenging to realize. What would you say is the biggest challenge?
The fact that the scenarios do not, they are not very good at capturing the political and social dimension of transformation. And the key challenge, I suspect, is not in technology and economics. It's probably in achieving this or putting the right political framework in place in order to achieve these scenarios, and also to build social acceptance for these kinds of pathways or strong political requirements that we have to achieve them.
I'm quite sure we will get back to just that area a bit later by one of the other speakers. But another question, this might be a leading one, but this is a Nordic climate adaptation conference. And I checked it up, and Denmark has a goal of being a low-emission society by 2050. Iceland has a goal of 50 to 75% emission reductions compared to 1990. Finland and Norway are in line with the EU's EU-wide target of at least 80% up to 95% reduction by 2050. And Sweden, as you mentioned, has a net zero by 2045. Is this enough?
For 1.5, it's not enough. I mean, also the Swedish goal is not enough. You have to sort of create space for countries like China, Brazil, South Africa. You mentioned the administration in the United States right now. Countries that are far from as ambitious as the Nordic countries. You need to create space for them to catch up eventually also. So, no, it's not enough.
Okay. So we have a bit more to work on. Yeah. But thank you again for your presentation, Matthias. So please take your seat. And in addition to pathways to reach 1.5 degrees, a large focus of the IPCC report is describing the consequences of a 1.5 degree warmer world compared to even warmer worlds. And to give us a presentation of this, we have Erik Källström. And Erik was until recently head of SMHI's climate modeling unit, the Rossby Center. Recently, though, you have been appointed as professor in climatology at SMHI, which is the first time that SMHI is appointing such a professor. Furthermore, he is adjunct professor at the Department of Meteorology at the Stockholm University. So, Erik, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Petter. I will talk a bit about impacts, as said. So it's impacts at 1.5 degree. I will also touch upon 2 degrees and also higher warming levels to some extent. This is just to show how the report looks like. It's a very nice graph. This is the front page of it, and it's a piece of artwork made based on one of the figures in the report, as I've understood it. Impacts are described in chapter 3 of this report. It has some 3 lead authors, and there are some 20 authors altogether, and a large number of contributing authors as well to this chapter. A few hundred pages, so it's a really thick chapter, really describing both climate change and also impacts of climate change. So there is no way I can tell you everything about that chapter in a few minutes. I will give you some few headlines, and then I can recommend the further reading of the chapter itself. Just to start off again with 1.5 degree, what that really is and where we are today. So Mark already mentioned it. We are close to 1 degree today in 2017 if we look at the human-induced warming. This is stated in this report. We can also look at the last few decades here and see that in the last 20-year period here, as you can see, 1991 to 2010, there was about half a degree warming if you compare to a previous period, 1960 to 80 roughly. So we have seen this kind of 0.5 degree warming in the recent few decades. So that can be kind of a measure that we can have when we look into the future as well to compare with. The current warming is about 0.2 degrees per decade, so this indicates that we will reach this 1.5 degree in like 25 years or so from now. The report is quite clear also that there is not only one scenario, there is not only one 1.5 degree world. So the assessment is based on very many different global and climate model projections. Some of them are transient, where we have a very strong trend and increasing temperatures globally. Others are stabilized climate scenarios at the end of the century. And some are also long-term, very long-term projections. So, and these will be very different when you look at, for instance, extremes and things like that. So there is not just one picture here. It's a mixture of very different results. Having said that, they also state in this report that, of course, there is a lot of observed impacts already now. We know that climate has changed a lot, and as they state here, this citation here is that human-induced warming has already caused multiple observed changes in the climate system, which then have large impacts both on organisms, ecosystems, as well as on human beings, of course. So this is a statement saying something about where we are today. Climate change in the report is, there is a lot of results, of course, and descriptions of that, but these are 2 kind of key messages, I think, that you can lift out from this one. The first one saying that for the future, there are substantial differences in temperature and also extreme events. If you look at the the 1.5 degree time window, when that is reached, the climate at that point will be substantially different from what we see today. So this is one message. The second message is that there are also, of course, very strong changes between 1.5 and 2. This may sound a bit evident, of course, but this is what it really says also. I mean, there are clear differences between these different warming levels, and that is something that has a large, of course, impact on all effects and impacts of climate change. So they are clearly different at these different warming levels. Temperature extremes is one thing that is stressed over and over again. So there are large differences already in the observed climate, but also in the future as well. And this comes out of this report from time to time as well. Speaking about impacts and risks or reasons for concern, as they use in this report, they have lifted out a number of different areas here where they have kind of tried to look at these risks, how large they are, and at different warming levels. And here you can see, starting from 0 degree to 1 degree, where we are today, the grayish area here, and then further into 1.5 and 2 degrees, these risks. And the redder the colors get in these bars, the worse are the risks, and the larger are the impacts as well. And starting out from the left, we have like warm water corals, which is one thing that has been really pointed out in this report. And it's a complete disaster what we are seeing already today. There is a lot of bleaching of these corals, and in the future we will see complete, more or less dieback of all of these, at least especially at the 2 degrees scenario that is pointed out here. So there are some differences between 1.5 and 2, of course. And you can see the colors all the time get more and more deep when you get further to the top. So it really means that there is a large impact of trying to keep the temperatures low. They also point to the Arctic region. Arctic ecosystems is one thing that is pointed out, and we are close to the Arctic. The Nordic countries are partly in the Arctic region, so this is an area where we have large changes and impacts as well. Some short statements about differences between 1.5 and 2 degrees. They are partly related to ecosystems, but also partly related to societies. And it's very clear from this report that there are differences in how people and the societies are impacted of different changes. As they state, there are less extreme weather events where people live at 1.5 compared to 2 degrees. There is a large number of people, fewer, that will be exposed to high sea level at 1.5 degree to 2 degrees. They talk about 10 million people. And as you can see, there is a long list here of these different statements that really clearly, very clearly shows that the societies and people are really going to be much more affected at 2 degrees compared to 1 degree. So I will finish off just by saying just a very few things about the Nordic region. These are not statements directly from the report, but it's just some reflections on our climate and where we see really strong changes in the Nordic region. And I think this is very much related, of course, to the content of the report as well. The changes in the Arctic region are very large already now, and we see them in the scenarios. And this also, of course, impacts the Nordic countries very directly. I think the changes in the wintertime temperatures is something which is very, very strong and significant, that really sticks out when we look at, or stands out when we look at our scenarios and also in the observations. In this Nordic region, we see, of course, increasing precipitation. In summer times, it's partly offset by strong evaporation, like this summer. We had a very dry summer, so there is also risk, of course, of drought seasons and periods even in our region as well. Both this report and all other studies as well, they show clearly changes in extremes in the future. There will be much less warm extremes, more heavy precipitation extremes. There will be much less cold extremes. So there is one type of weather extremes that will be changed in the other direction, not so severe in the future. And again, I just point back again to this fact that we have already seen a very pronounced climate change signal, and you can think about this kind of 0.5 degree, where that would take us. If you look back a few decades, you can see that there are some parallels to what have been happening over the last few decades. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Erik. As many of you know, and as Marco told us earlier, in Paris, countries got together to agree on a new climate target. The old one used to be to limit global warming to 2 degrees, but in Paris they decided to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees and aim at 1.5. And as Matthias' presentation showed, reaching 2 degrees will be tough. Reaching 1.5 degree will be a lot tougher even. So considering this challenge and what you've seen from the report, you as a climate scientist, would you say it's worth it? Going for 1.5 degrees instead of 2?
I definitely think so. If you look at the impacts, if you had looked at the slide where I have all of these bullets affecting people all over the world, especially in poor countries, I would say, where the resilience also is lower and it's more difficult to tackle these changes, I think definitely. And more so also for the natural ecosystems of the world, I think there is that is something we have to really be the voice of these ecosystems as well as climate scientists, I think, in this context.
Okay, thank you again, Erik. You will soon join us for the panel discussion, but before that we have one more speaker, and that is Karen O'Brien. Karen is professor at the Department of Sociology and Human Geography at the University of Oslo, and she has actually participated in 4 previous IPCC reports, but not this one, not the 1.5 degree report. Also, even though she lives in Norway, has lived there very long and speaks very good Norwegian, she is a foreigner in a sense, so which gives her a double outside-inside perspective, both on the 1.5 degree report, but also into the Nordic region, considering that this is a Nordic adaptation conference. And today you will be speaking about adaptation and mitigation, as well as sustainable development, focusing on actions. So Karen, please, the stage is yours.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, I've lived in the Nordic region longer than anywhere in my life, so I think that this is home. And I think it's also really, what's going on here is very much related to what I want to talk about, is that the relationship between adaptation, mitigation, and sustainable development, and why it's so important to take the global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius report and really put it into a much bigger context, and that is the context of sustainable development. So what I'm going to really focus on is the 5th chapter of the report, which is on sustainable development, poverty eradication, and reducing inequalities. And this is such an important chapter because it really takes that 1.5 challenge and puts it into this much wider context of what type of development are we going to be seeing. And also that recognizing that climate change is an equity issue. It's a development issue, it's a social issue, and unless we look at it all together and hold these multiple ideas of adaptation, mitigation, and sustainable development in our heads together, we will fail, which they make quite clear. So how do we then understand this? And I think that this is the report really resonates with a lot of the earlier IPCC reports, and it also gives a rigorous interpretation of what's really at stake in terms of the trade-offs and inequalities. And what we know is that sustainable development is essential for actually reaching the 1.5 degree goals. And it says here that the fundamental societal and systems transitions and transformations to help limit global warming are really dependent on the way that we develop in the future. Very specifically, it talks about the potential to significantly reduce systemic vulnerability, enhance adaptive capacity, and promote livelihood security for poor and disadvantaged populations. And the idea that climate change isn't going to be experienced the same for everybody, and that for some people, 1.5 degrees is really serious in terms of not just people, but places and sectors and things, becomes a really important factor in addressing climate change. So how do we then look at the synergies with adaptation? Most of adaptations are really aimed at reducing risk and vulnerability. So obviously they're going to be really good for reducing poverty, for food security, for global health, and for water security and access. But one of the things that is also a concern is that for all the efforts we're making towards the SDGs, we could end up very much being stable and almost like running in a treadmill, just adapting and trying to keep the levels of poverty at the same, because we're constantly changing that baseline. And that's where mitigation comes in as really important. That once we realize that adaptation, we can't just keep adapting to climate change and hoping to meet the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, but we also have to work on equally hard on mitigation. And mitigation also has many synergies with climate change, including reductions of the consequences of air pollution, for example. But there's also a number of trade-offs between the SDGs and climate change adaptation. For example, depending on how we go about increasing food security or contributing to zero hunger, we may, depending on the interventions, we may actually be increasing the runoff of nitrogen into marine ecosystems, or we may be we might be drilling for wells, much deeper wells, and one person or group or village's adaptation could actually increase the vulnerability for many others. And so the idea that not every adaptation is a good one in the context of sustainable development is something to really keep in mind. And that becomes important in terms of who's deciding and what are the best adaptation strategies. And likewise, this goes for mitigation, because it's very easy to look at mitigation and say, oh, we all need air conditioners to adapt to heat waves and things, but that also drives climate change even higher. So being able to hold all these and look at the feedbacks and look at the synergies and trade-offs becomes really critical. And I think the most important message that really comes out of here is that climate change really is about social justice and equity when it comes down to it. When we start to see that the pathways to limit global warming really have to be inclusive, and we have to start to look at not just how do we become a well-adapted Nordic region, but how do we adapt the entire world? How do we mitigate climate change to reduce those risks and vulnerabilities for everyone? And that call and that recognition that smart cities and climate smart agriculture and things, that it has to really be there has to be an equity plan in there. And if we don't, we're going to have a world that doesn't actually work for everybody and probably not meeting those sustainable development goals. And as we heard in the earlier talks, we've already reached 1 degree of global warming, and what we see is that we are experiencing the impacts. We are, vulnerabilities are revealed, and it's usually the disadvantaged and the poor that are the most affected, but not always sometimes it's in our own cities, in countries and things. The picture on your right comes from Norway this summer, where temperatures were really high and many farmers experienced dramatic losses. So vulnerability comes out in many different ways. The report also emphasizes at the end that this is really about all of us, and that we need collective efforts, not just among governments at the international level, but also within every organization, with every group, within towns, within cities. It really is, how do we work together to make these? And I think we just saw in Eric's presentation, just how big of a challenge it is to meet the 1.5 target by 2028. And we saw that we can borrow a little bit, but it really is this an enormous challenge that is going to take a different way of collaboration among everybody. And that leads me to my final slide, which is really that this report highlights the need for societal transformations and rapid implementation of greenhouse gas emissions if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And it actually says that sustainable development will be exceedingly difficult to achieve, if not impossible, unless we actually do those things. So in many ways, the 1.5 degree report is really the marching orders, or the underlining of the marching orders from the Paris Agreement, telling us that really we have to take climate change mitigation seriously, adaptation seriously, and sustainable development seriously. And so that it really shapes it. And I think that this chapter could really be like the starting point for looking at what we do next, the practices. So thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Karen. And as I mentioned in my presentation of you, you've participated in 4 previous IPCC reports. And I'm wondering, the perspectives that you're presented here today on sustainable development and social equity, how have those perspectives developed from the first reports you've been involved in until this latest report from the IPCC?
I think this latest report is very innovative in that it really highlights the equity dimensions and poverty reduction, and also, just what's on this slide, it calls for societal transformations, and that in the earlier reports was highly political. It was really hard to get that word transformation into the summary for policymakers because it's who's going to transform whom in what direction. So bringing it front and center in this report by the request of governments who are interested in, and the 1.5 goal comes from a concern that 1.5 degrees is too much climate change for many nations and groups. So I think it is it's path-breaking in that it starts to open a new language where we can start to talk about the much larger societal transformations that are needed, rather than just greenhouse gas emission reductions, which are part of it.
Thank you again so much, Karen. And now, please, if you can move over here, and our previous speakers are also able to get up and join you around that table. It's now time for our panel discussion. And as I said earlier today, I very much encourage you all to come up with very tough questions. You're around 200 people in this room, and you represent, in addition to researchers, you represent local stakeholders from municipalities, regional stakeholders, you represent companies, NGOs, and you're just about as many people in this room as there are countries in the world. And we get along together, and we still are able to agree with big things in the world, even though we're 200. So I'm looking forward to getting some interaction from you. And if you have a question, please raise your hand. We do have a couple of colleagues here who have microphones who will be then, you'll be able to ask your question by microphone. And please make sure that you speak in the microphone when you ask your question so that our friends who are not here in the room but who are following this seminar by live streaming are also able to hear your question. But before we start with the first question from the audience, I thought I'd take the opportunity to ask one more question from my side, which is the moderators. The nice thing about being a moderator. And my question is, and I'd like to have the whole table answer that, what is the biggest surprise of this report? And if we start with you, Marco.
Well, I was surprised that there is so much science on 1.5 and the difference between 1.5 and 2, that it was in so many counts possible to actually quantify the difference and show what the one and the other one means. I thought it would be somewhere there, but not to this extent that the report now shows.
Yeah, I think this works. I can only agree with Marco. I think when scientists have been working with papers over the last few years, there have been really big calls for papers on this, on the 1.5 degree, and 2 years ago and one year ago there was very little information there. But obviously there is a good report with a lot of number of papers in it, and I think that's a very good work of the scientific society, I think.
Okay, and for me it's that so many scenarios actually achieve 1.5. Which is a clear update since the last report, the fifth assessment report of the IPCC. The carbon budget has increased since then. We know more about the climate dynamics and the climate system. We know more about the carbon budgets available. So that's a good sign, I would say. But it also puts some sort of, you need to understand the uncertainties around these budgets. It's really complicated, I would say.
And I would agree with that and say that it's really great that they see that that we have the that we can technically achieve 1.5, and that it really highlights the social challenges of it. The fact that this is really a societal debate that has to go beyond just the regular, like let's just reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but it really becomes more than political but social.
Thank you very much for that. Again, if you have any questions, please raise your hand. If not, I will still use my moderator's privilege and ask more questions. But I see one over there, so.
Yes, Is this on? Yes. I have a question. For some of the scenarios, there's a lot of belief in the bioenergy CCS technology. I mean, wouldn't that require huge land areas that would have to be grown for energy crops or something? And wouldn't this have a huge effect on the other sustainable development goals as well?
Yeah. Oh, do you want to take it? Yeah, I would say that that's exactly one of the trade-offs that was kind of in those figures of the SDGs that they look at. And if you read the chapter 5, you'll see that there's a wide literature that shows that that bioenergy does threaten livelihoods. It really depends on the way it's carried out and the extent.
Absolutely, and I should probably also add that the trade-offs between lots of carbon dioxide removals and food price, food security and so on, they are great, but also there have been some tests when you exclude BECCS from the models, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage from the models, the demand for bioenergy increases rather than decreases because you need to phase out lots of fossil quicker and using more bioenergy to achieve that. So it's not a simple puzzle of avoiding BECCS to avoid these kinds of trade-offs. If you avoid BECCS, it may also become even a bigger problem. So that also has to be at the back of your head when you think about these things.
And we have a question there in the back as well.
Hi, I'm Elena Martins, science communicator at SMHI. And Marco, you mentioned that the reactions to the report span between alarmist, balanced, and conservative, so according to already existent previous beliefs. So what makes you think, or what can we expect from the next meeting in Katowice? Can we expect really a change in action? Or in other words, is this report a game changer, or is just one more to pile up?
Uh-oh. First of all, I mean, the reactions have been mainly in the middle, as expected, that most people sort of take this as being the authoritative, well-done science assessment and so on. Katowice, well, personally I will be looking at the language that comes out of Katowice in the conclusions, what the countries actually write down, and what one then may be able to interpret on what they may be willing to do. But I would be very surprised if Katowice brought 1.5 degrees with it, instead of the goal that was set in Paris. But the language will be interesting to keep an eye out, and it may give us some more signals of what is to come.
One thing that I'd like to follow up, I think there's a question over here, but in the meantime, when the microphone gets there, Matthias, you said this is very tough. Eric, you said that it's worth it. And now we're at a conference where there is a lot of representatives from municipalities and from the local level. And from that, I wanted to ask you, Karen, do you have any good examples of where there actually has been successful change and transformation? Could be from climate area, but could be from other areas, from your research. What could we in the climate and climate mitigation and adaptation community learn from good examples?
Well, we could go to the example from my country right now, where the politics is very polarized and where climate policies are kind of going backwards, and we pulled out of the Paris Agreement. But what that has done is that has really motivated and engaged and activated so many people and groups at the grassroots level who are really doing things, at the state level, at the city level, at the regional level. And you start to see that, like that idea of transformation is being kind of embodied in school systems, all over the place. So it really, I think that we're actually seeing a lot of transformations happening all over the place. They're not always on the radar for what we're looking at. They don't necessarily necessarily get the news coverage, but it's really the lots of little things that are happening that are bubbling together, and kind of they're all in its own social context and political context and things. So I think that's where what interests me is looking like off the radar and out of the big media headlines and seeing where, and especially as we've talked about at this conference, different generations that are just kind of saying like, no, this is, you know, they're looking at this report and saying, this isn't new. We're on it.
So my question is Jens Hesselbjerg Christensen, the University of Copenhagen. My question is a little bit related to this, and I'd like the different members of the panel's view on this, is that this transformation that you talk about, which I believe obviously is what is also needed to get this very strong reduction and actually go into the take-up. But the question is then, what is it actually that entails to make a transformation? What is it the decision makers in this room and those who are not in the room but are sitting in government, what is what is the advice that they have to do? Do you have an opinion about this?
Let's start there.
Well, I mean, first of all, what Karin was saying, that I also like to emphasize that some of the transformations we see, some we don't see. I mean, when the energy systems change, most people don't care that the electricity is made in some other way than before, for example. Then again, if you think about sort of making cities that do not need cars on the streets, I mean, we need tens of cities, that will take time, and that would sort of show up as well. How it could come about, I don't know. But I still think for the policy is really the clear message, and also to follow up the decision or policy or measure with tools, how to achieve the goal. If you think about Sweden right now, where their goals, sort of the emissions from transportation, for example, they are rather tough measures, but we are probably not yet there to meet the target. I mean, there's something missing in policy, tools, incentives, taxes, whatever it may be, that is probably going to be needed. So to give the tools to meet the target, which is a bit fuzzy, but maybe in the right direction at least.
I could take that also just as a follow-up, because I think that one of the real challenges for everyone in the room is really like to recognize that every single person has that capacity to change a system, and that's where it is. This is a collective problem, and mostly we've been reducing people to their carbon footprints, individuals, the rest of the world. The decision makers tell people what to do, and when we start to realize that everybody has that capacity to actually, to transform some system, whether it's a household dinner plan or a church group picnic or a cafeterias in your university or whatever. And that, I think, activating that type of agency becomes really important. And I'm living that in Oslo, where we start to see transformation just happening around us with not just the cars, but the entire way that we're dealing with food and energy.
Björn-Ola Linnér from Linköping University. It seems to me that there has been a change of discourse in when we should achieve the 1.5 degree target, because in the Paris Agreement, in Article 2, it says that we should stay below 1.5, or aspiring, stay below, well below 2, and aspire to stay below, not exceed 1.5. And in Article 4, it talks about balancing sources and sinks by 2100. And when the SIDS, the Small Island Developing States, has pushed for 1.5, it was not to exceed it. But now we talk about that we should have achieved it by 2100. So we can, as Matthias elegantly showed, that we borrow from the future and so on. So was there a lot of discussion? Do you agree with this picture? And then was there a lot of discussion? There must have been some discussion from the SIDS, at least, of this shift, if you agree with that.
Well, I think Paris Agreement called for the ambition of 1.5 rather than below 1.5. And I mean, the 1.5, I mean, you said 2100, but I guess it's 1.5. Either to stay below 1.5 for good or overshoot and come back to 1.5 by 2100. The pathways which I discussed in the report. But I mean, when the summary for policymakers was discussed in South Korea a couple of weeks ago, the small island states were not overly concerned. I mean, they did pay attention to that the pathways that do not pass 1.5 or do not pass high above 1.5 wouldn't be emphasized. They want to emphasize the below 1.5 for good or just a little overshoot or so. And there, of course, was a discussion of what is possible and what the different countries want and so on. The small island states and least developed countries are also very mindful of having effects and impacts reflected, what will sort of be impacting them, that they would be picked up at the conclusions and report and so on, which is very understandable.
We have room for 2 more questions. So firstly here.
Yeah, my name is Darli Shusavik from the Department of International Environment and Development Studies, Norwegian University of Life Sciences. So thank you for the very insightful discussions. But my question is, does the IPCC believe that the emission reductions is possible within the neoliberal framework of development? Do they discuss anything about it within the report? It would be interesting to listen to your insights on this. Thank you.
I mean, the report sort of discusses that there are many synergies, as Karen pointed out, between sustainable development and climate efforts, but also possible goal conflicts. The report also discusses that when it comes to feasibility, whether it's possible to do this at all, that it's not only about money, it's not only about policy, it's not only about technological change, it's not only about lifestyles, institutions, it's all about them. And to quote the press conference where the summary of policymakers was made public, the authors, the scientists said, well, this is what we had done is a recipe for the world, or a road atlas, or something of that sort, where the countries can then discuss and see whether they will follow it or not.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Nikolai Pritz. I'm a sustainability consultant with EY in Norway. My question is to the communication of key findings in the report. And because with climate change, climate science, it's difficult, and you see that many people become complacent with the difficulty of how we reach these very ambitious targets. So, as you pointed out, new scenarios in the 1.5 report show that it is possible, and several of these scenarios do so, but with a large degree of overshoot. And that in itself could also be difficult, that people think that, yeah, this is possible, and kind of, because we can always catch up. So I'd like to get your perspectives on what is the most constructive way to convey and communicate the report to decision makers in private sector and different industries for them to make the right decisions now to kind of put us at least in the direction of reaching 1.5.
I can maybe just quickly comment on that a little bit. I mean, it's not just the overshoot. It's very much about the rate of change as well. So if there is a very quick increase in temperatures now, I mean, that's also a very strong message, since that will also, I mean, further increase the impacts, especially for instance, sea level rise is something which is worse if there's a strong increase in temperature first and then an overshoot and then you get back again. The sea level rise at the end will become worse than at another scenario. So there are things that you can discuss already with the kind of the strength of the increase in temperature, for instance. So that's one thing to communicate, I think.
Yeah, also importantly, most of the scenarios in the report that have sort of formed the foundation for the report, they don't have overshoots or have very limited overshoot, which is new compared to the previous, the old kind of scenarios we are familiar with. So actually, the literature is moving away from sort of allowing an overshoot in temperature towards not allowing it, which is interesting. That's something new in the report, I think. But it's really, really to talk about avoiding the moral hazard, avoiding thinking about, yeah, we can make this. It's possible, so we don't have to do as much right now, because it's not possible unless you do everything you can right now and still have to rely on some negative emissions in the future. So you cannot sort of postpone the traditional or conventional mitigation actions or reduce demand measures or changed lifestyles, new diets and so on. It's demanded alongside some negative emissions. And depending how quick we can make the early reductions, the less we have to depend on postponing carbon dioxide removals into the future, basically.
Thank you very much for that reply. And we're at the end of the session now, so thank you very much for all of you listening to this. I want to take the chance to just one final question, and one of you answered that, a volunteer. And considering that there are people here representing municipalities and companies, what is the one thing that they should take with them, their main point from the report in today's discussion? Who will want to volunteer? Go for it, Karen.
No, I would say that that what we do right now matters, and every degree matters, and like taking that home, and as you just said, bringing it really home. I think it's so clear in the report that we matter, as in part as systems changers.
Thank you. And with that, I very much want to thank the entire panel for participating in this session, as well as a thank you to the audience, especially those of you who've asked questions, and also those of you who are not here in the room but have been following us online. Thank you for your patience and interest, and I hope that once you leave this room that you feel like both urgency but also inspiration to continue on with your work on both mitigation and adaptation. So with that, thank you again and have a nice evening.